And so, welcome, folks. I've started the recording. I've got Douglas's permission to do so. He's um, promised not to tell too many deep, dark secrets about New York and things like that. But welcome. This is our second. This is our second in a series of webinars on the Fair Housing Act, which came about because I know zero about it and I'm teaching the class, so I had to get other people to teach it and help us out on it. So I'm going to reintroduce to us Diane, who has put this series together for us, and she was our first presenter. And I'm going to ask Diane to present Douglas for us. So Diane, take it away, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Professor Schuster. It's my great pleasure to get to introduce Douglas Adams. I promised I wouldn't embarrass. Actually, I did promise I wouldn't embarrass him, but I'll just say first, he's one of the smartest people I know, and he's doing really great work in New York City in the mayor's office, and so I'll let him explain and introduce that part. But just one of my oldest friends too. I've known him since sixth grade, and I've gotten to see this great path, and I'm excited for all of the work that you've been doing in relation to planning. And I thought of you right away, actually, when talking about this series with Randy, because I knew that you were very much working to incorporate equity and social justice issues into your work and seeing how that all fit together. And so I'm super excited for everyone else to get to hear what you're working on, or at least what's happening, or what are some possible applications of some of the history stuff that we talked about last week. So I think it's actually super exciting because what you're doing is right there, and I think will give students so much good ideas for how to apply these concepts that we're talking about. So thank you very much, Douglas, for coming. Well, okay, for joining us from so far away. And I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both, Professor Schuster and Professor Carlson, for inviting me. I called Diane a few months ago around the time of the Black Lives Matter protests, as my work started to shift a bit, and getting involved with some of the city's efforts around equity. And I knew that she, in addition to being a great friend, might also have some useful tidbits for me to influence my thinking on this, and she certainly did. But through that conversation, I think she became more aware of what I was working on, and had a bit of a back and forth since. So good morning from sunny Brooklyn. I am going to turn off my camera and switch to presentation. So let me do that. Okay. Everybody can see the presentation?
Yep, it's looking really good.
Great. Okay. And I will do my best to keep an eye on the chats and address people's questions. Depending on the question, I might answer it at the time it pops up or hold off to the end. So if it gets skipped, by all means, please bring it up again. Hopefully that won't be the case. All right, so talking about equity and fairness in local government capital spending. As Diane and Professor Schuster mentioned, I'm with the City of New York, specifically City Hall and the Mayor's Office. At the Mayor's Office, I'm with the Mayor's Office of Capital Project Development, which falls under the Office of Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development. I've been in the planning field for about 20 years, and with the Mayor's Office for about 5 years. My typical work in the Mayor's Office is working with sort of a construction manager slash project director role. I work with city agencies to get their capital projects done faster, more efficiently. These are typically projects that are of particular importance to the mayor and the administration, and I I'm sort of a fixer and expediter to keep their work on track and deliver for our citizens. But more recently have gotten pulled in with some efforts that have been going on a bit behind the scenes in New York around equity associated with our capital spending. And that's what I will go into in more detail. Okay. All right, so what do we mean? What do I mean when I say equity? The dictionary definition says that's freedom from bias or favoritism. Here's some additional text from an executive order issued by the mayor last year. Equity refers to fair access to services, resources, and opportunities. Achieving equity means addressing structural, historic, multi-generational, intersectional, and complex actions and inactions that produce disparities on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, income, and other factors. And there's Lawrence Brown is a professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore, one of the historic black universities, who has done some amazing work in this area. And for him, equity is investing the most where people have the least, or in communities that have the least, to help address historic injustices or imbalances. So how does equity relate to this class in your work specifically? This, of course, is a design, surveying, and land planning class, as I understand it. But the discussion of equity and capital spending at its core is a conversation about public policy. So what's the relationship between public policy and design? In city planning circles, there's a lot of sort of push-pull between design and public policy. Most city planning programs are within schools of architecture, but some, like the one I went to at New York University, are within School of Public Administration, aka public policy schools. I firmly believe that good design, good land planning, etc. isn't possible without having a firm foundation of public policy. For urban design and planning to truly work, it must be rooted in sound public policy, which is the focus of this conversation. Okay. All right. Inequitable policies and spending. Disparate negative impacts on people of color. When we say something is inequitable, or at least when I say something is inequitable, typically it means that it's creating a negative impact often on people of color relative to other people. And here's a few examples of some of those inequitable practices. De jure racism refers to policies or laws that specifically favor one race over another, and that's their intention, such as it being legal to fire someone based solely on skin color prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, or racial segregation of schools. Those were policies that specifically had racist text or intent behind them. Separate from that, and more subtle, is de facto racism, which includes policies and practices that result in negative impacts on people of color relative to white people, regardless of the actual text and intent behind the policy. The success of a policy can only be truly measured by its results or outcomes, and if the outcomes are racially unequal, if they are disparate and negative towards people of color, then how sound is the policy? And going into a few of these examples, redlining, while arguably more de jure than de facto racism, the practice of redlining is critical to our conversation today. I understand that Professor Carlson spoke on this last week, so I'll just touch on it briefly. Bear with me a second. The practice was legal until 1977, and it made mortgages more difficult or impossible to obtain in non-white neighborhoods, reducing black family wealth creation. Homeownership is the primary means of wealth building in the U.S. The creation of the 30-year mortgage during the 1930s led to a dramatic increase in homeownership. Prior to the 1930s and the creation of the 30-year mortgage, typically mortgage products were like a 5-year mortgage rather than a 30-year mortgage, which would make them out of reach for most folks. The 30-year mortgage changed that. And home ownership became the primary means of family wealth building in the U.S. However, until the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 made it illegal, banks wouldn't lend money for mortgages on homes in communities of color. These areas were mapped or redlined and described as less desirable or even infiltrated by lower grade populations. It's estimated that the practice has reduced Black family wealth by an average of $200,000 over the past 40 years, which doesn't even include the 40 years prior to that. Other practices that are racist from a de facto standpoint when we look at their outcomes relative to people of color. Urban renewal. This first took off in a big way in the U.S. with the Housing Act of 1949, which provided tons of federal money for local governments to remove so-called blighted areas and slums, typically non-white areas, and converting those areas to so-called higher value housing, freeways, and economic development. Owners were forced off their property through eminent domain and received nominal reimbursement for the property. As white areas began to be impacted in the 1970s, urban renewal was scaled back, although it continues at a smaller scale today. Single-family zoning and housing affordability. Single-family zoning has largely taken the place of redlining in terms of a tool standing in the way of home ownership for lower income Americans. The policy of single-family zoning, and by single-family zoning I mean zoning that says an area can only consist of single house for one family on a lot. Typically you see like quarter-acre lots with one house and cul-de-sacs and the like. We're talking about the typical suburbs. So single-family zoning speaks directly to the relationship between public policy, land use, and outcomes for those affected by these policies. Starting in the early 20th century, many municipalities attempted to zone residential areas by race. But the Supreme Court deemed that to be illegal in 1917. And then cities turned to single-family zoning to achieve virtually the same. While it was promoted as a modern tool for separating homes from noxious uses, and it was facilitated by mass car ownership that allowed people to travel longer distances faster, it was, in fact, with minimum lot and housing sizes and dwelling unit restrictions, a means of excluding those who couldn't afford to live there. In addition, many houses had deed restrictions that only allowed white ownership, which was not made illegal until 1968. You hear a lot of in the ether these days on the news regarding the White House feeling like saying that Democrats want to destroy the suburbs. What the White House is talking about specifically is a desire by Democrats and others to fully enforce the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and with that enforcement taking the form of restricting federal housing funds for communities that are not providing a range of affordable and fair housing opportunities. That's all there is to this. If a community went to the feds and say, hey, we want a housing grant, if the Fair Housing Act was enforced properly, then the feds would say, okay, well, you're doing, as a community, you're doing a fine job in terms of housing affordability, so and meeting the needs of lower income residents, so you get the grant. What this enforcement would do would say, if a community has demonstrated that they've provided very little in the way of housing affordability, then those federal funds would not be available to them. Of course, very few federal housing funds are relatively small anyway, and wealthier municipalities aren't generally asking for them. So the notion that this would destroy the suburbs is, well, I'll leave it at that. Lastly, on the single-family zoning issue, one of the strongest factors influencing whether a family or person escapes poverty is where that person grows up or lives, whether they grow up in an entirely poor neighborhood or a mixed or wealthier neighborhood. Thus, single-family zoning not only directly inhibits family wealth building by limiting affordable housing options, it also locks lower-income persons out of one of the primary factors associated with rising out of poverty, not living in an entirely low-income neighborhood. And there's a lot of data around what I just said there. A few other quick examples of de facto racist policies. Policies and sentencing practices and drug laws, our criminal justice system, that is. When we see incarceration rates for people of color that far exceed the rates at which they actually commit crimes, which in turn reduces their lifetime economic opportunity, that is a policy. While you read the text, it may not appear racist. Nonetheless, in terms of the disparate outcomes, it is. Property tax-based school funding. With this, we see per capita student spending between rich and poor districts vary by as much as $10,000 per student per year. That's what we see in some areas of New York, which has some of the worst disparities relative to this in the country, but it's certainly a national issue, and the result is negative education outcomes for lower income students who are simply not having their education funded as well. Lastly, most recently in the news, you may have heard that death rates from COVID-19 are significantly greater among people of color relative to white people. This is attributed to a lot of factors, but among them include overcrowded housing, lower wage, higher risk jobs, and unequal access to healthcare. Okay, a lot of background there. Next. All right, I'm going to dive into New York City. The city has 8.4 million people, which is by far the largest municipality in the country. The city consists of 5 counties or boroughs, the names of which most of you are familiar with: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Staten Island. There are, believe it or not, 325,000 municipal employees of the city. I am one of them. The city has an annual operating budget or expense budget of $86 billion. The expense budget covers things like salaries, education, social services, pensions, benefits, fire, and police protection. And we separate from the operating or expense budget is our capital budget, which is annually about $8.5 billion. And capital budget, which I'm going to dive into a lot more detail, those are items, those are physical improvements that are worth more than $35,000 with a useful life of at least 5 years. That's at least how the city of New York has chosen to define what a capital item is, but it's very similar in other communities. Those capital budget items include schools, transportation facilities, water and sewer infrastructure, parks, libraries, etc. And just as a point of reference, if New York City was a state, it would have the 5th largest operating budget in the country, just behind Florida. I do see a question pop up from Professor Schuster. So condominiums or owned apartments would be different from single family. Yes, they would. Those would be multi-unit buildings, multi-family buildings, and those units, understandably, since they're not on a piece of, they don't have a yard, they may be smaller than a single-family home. They tend to be cheaper, and thus they are more affordable for lower-income people. So, if a city is providing or allowing for a range of housing affordability, then they would be encouraging housing in the form of condominiums, or in New York we call them apartments, even though we own them and don't rent them, versus simply just producing the usual single-family homes. And yes, they're easier to own from an income standpoint, since they're cheaper. Lower-income people can qualify for those mortgages. But the key thing is, by enabling lower-income folks to purchase that sort of housing, it builds just as if they had bought a single-family home. It may not be as great because that's dependent on the cost of the house, but certainly gives them a foot into family wealth building opportunity. Lending. Okay, another question. Duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. Are they considered single family? No, they aren't. Single family refers to a single building with a single family in it. And Professor Schuster, you asked about lending. I'm not entirely certain I understand the question.
So the question then is, do mortgage providers look differently on a single family home than on a condominium or something like that because it's maybe harder to recoup money or foreclose or this or that or the other thing? Do they have equal lending opportunities for both of those?
I think so is the short answer. I don't believe, I could be wrong, I don't believe from a lending standpoint that they're considered higher risk. I think risk is more tied to a person's individual, say credit score. But simply by virtue of being in a multi-family building, I don't think that negatively affects the ease of getting a mortgage. Okay. A bit more on New York. Here's a racial map of the city. Like most American cities, New York is relatively segregated, which relates directly to our discussion. Since many, if not most, individual neighborhoods are fairly segregated, it's important to look at our capital spending at the neighborhood level if our goal is to achieve equity and fairness in that spending. So you see vast areas of the country where vast areas of the city where one color on the map predominates, which indicates that the neighborhood is or the part of the city is relatively segregated by that race. You do see smaller areas where you see quite a number of different colored dots in one area, such as I don't know if my pointer works, but Central Queens is an incredibly diverse, non-segregated area. Okay. Getting into that New York City capital budget, the $8.5 billion or so a year. As we talk about policies and land use and the built environment, it's important to keep in mind that a budget is a government's ultimate expression of its policies and priorities. Politicians or city officials may say something that's important, but it may say that something is important, but if that's not demonstrated by the budget, then it's pretty much lip service. You can see how that $8.5 billion is broken out on the top. The biggest chunk goes to the construction of school facilities. A very big chunk for environmental protection, which generally refers to sewer and water facilities. Transportation takes a big chunk. That's street reconstruction, transit facilities, and the like. And just an example of what $10 million in capital spending buys in New York. I won't go through all of these, but that $10 million is the equivalent of 2 football fields and a park, 7 fire trucks, 29 recycling trucks, or 6% of the total lane miles that we resurface every year. So for $10 million, we can, of all the lanes that we resurface with new asphalt, $10 billion would cover 6% of that. Okay. All right. So attempting to look at that budget from an equity perspective. Let's see. Oh, I forgot a talking point. Certainly that capital spending shapes the built environment and urban form. Capital spending, so as I've said, is associated with parks, libraries, cultural facilities, community centers. All of that shapes the built environment, land use, and the urban form. And it strongly influences where people choose to live, be it an amenity-rich area or an amenity-poor area. And someone had a question about general services. I believe that refers to things like computer systems, vehicles, uh, a photocopier. Yeah, so I think that's what that bucket is. The city has a department of citywide administrative services. They're sort of like the facilities managers for the city. They make sure the water fountains are working and the lights are on. So that's a lot of what that money is. Okay, looking at this from an equity standpoint. On the left, you see $109 billion. It's a huge chunk of money. That's the city's 10-year capital spend. I mentioned that it's about $8.5 billion a year. Over 10 years, it's around $109 billion. Let's see, just bear with me a second. All right, so of that 110, if we want to look at this at a neighborhood level, only about 25 billion can be mapped to the neighborhood level to conduct a racial equity analysis. You see the 25 billion over there on the right. The other 84 billion is things like IT or vehicles or other things that aren't associated with specific neighborhoods, or spending in future years that hasn't been assigned to a specific location. For instance, if in 8 years the Department of Transportation knows they want to reconstruct 10 miles of streets around the city, but haven't identified where those locations are, then that would be indicated as part of the 109 billion in future years, but we aren't yet able to identify it at the neighborhood level, so thus we can't look at it from an equity standpoint yet. But as spending becomes more near term, we can increasingly look at it at the neighborhood level. Also included in that 84 billion that we can't analyze is projects with citywide rather than neighborhood specific benefits, such as improvements to the city's water distribution system, or waste management facilities that serve the city rather than a specific neighborhood. All right, so taking that 25 billion over there on the right and looking at that in more detail, what's the 25 billion associated with? Most of it is tied to 5 agencies. Those being the SCA is our school construction authority. They build the schools. DOT is Department of Transportation. DEP, that's Environmental Protection, Water and Sewer. DPR refers to the Department of Parks and Recreation. EDC, this is all on the left graph on the screen. EDC is the Economic Development Corporation, and that leaves 3.5 billion for other city departments. On the right, it takes a look at that $25 billion and its allocation by borough. And looking at it on the borough level, we can see that spending is generally equitable. For example, Queens has 27% of the city residents and receives 30% of the funding. So 27, 30, they're pretty much the same. Manhattan, similarly, Manhattan has 19% of city residents and receives 18% of the funding. So from that high level, it seems equitable. But what does it look like when we drill down further? I used to be a map maker, and this map on the left hurts the former cartographer in me, but it's what I had to work with. And yeah, so what do we see here? The Parks Department conducted an equity analysis in a lot of detail. The map on the left reflects $6 billion in capital investments spent on parks for 20 years, from 1992 to 2013. The areas seeing the least amount of spending are those shown in white, orange, and pale blue. Areas receiving the most spending are in the darkest blue. Again, the least amount of spending, white, orange, and pale blue. Most amount of spending on the left map is shown by darkest blue. Looking at the map on the right, you see the city's poverty rate. The darker the blue, the higher rate of poverty, and the darkest blue areas are the lowest income areas. The darkest blue areas also tend to have the highest concentrations of Black and Latino New Yorkers. You see a loose pattern between the two maps. The areas receiving the least amount of spending on parks on the left, again, that's white, orange, and pale blue areas, tend to correspond to the darkest blue, that is the poorest areas, on the right. It's also worth noting that the areas with the largest parks, which are shown in green in the map on the left, tend to correspond to the areas with the least poverty on the right. Yeah, so just visually, I think there's a pattern to be seen there. But drilling down into the data behind the maps a bit, parks require a lot of money for upkeep and refurbishment. Of the $6 billion spent on parks over those 20 years, less than $250,000 in improvements was spent on over 200 parks. $250,000 is not a lot in New York City. You don't come close to building a bathroom or a playground in a park for that, believe it or not. So more than half of those over 200 parks that received very little funding were in areas with above average rates of poverty, and a quarter of the parks receiving very little funding were located in neighborhoods with the highest rates of poverty. That does not represent equitable spending, nor is park spending unique. When we look at spending patterns on other amenities like schools and transportation improvements, we see something similar. All right, next. Okay, more on equity analysis by neighborhood. I'm going to leave New York for a moment because unfortunately there's only very limited public data regarding capital spending and equity in New York. And there's problems with that lack of public data, which I'll talk about in some later slides. But I'm switching to a different city, Baltimore, Maryland. And their data paints a clearer picture than I'm able to do with what's publicly available in New York. Relative to other cities such as New York, Baltimore has been pretty transparent with their equity analysis of capital spending. So what does that equity analysis show? The map on the left shows percentage of white residents with whiter neighborhoods concentrated in a strip running up the center of the map. So the map on the left, the darker the color, the whiter the neighborhood. The map on the right shows capital spending per resident from 2015 to 2017. And similar to the map showing the percentage of white residents, you see higher spending per resident in a strip running up the center of the map. So map on the right, darker equals more spending. Map on the left, darker equals whiter neighborhood. And you know, these maps require a little bit of a leap of faith, but of course there's data behind them. And what does the data behind the Baltimore maps tell us? Per capita spending in neighborhoods with the highest percentage of black residents was half that of neighborhoods with the lowest percentage. Spending in lower income neighborhoods was half that of middle income neighborhoods. Spending in neighborhoods with the lowest life expectancy was half that of other neighborhoods. All of which says this is what inequitable or unfair spending of tax money looks like. I hesitated to include this slide because it may seem to some people to be self-evident, but in any case, what's wrong with inequitable spending? So what? Well, if spending money in one neighborhood is a good thing, then not spending money in another neighborhood is a bad thing, right? But more to the point, there are a ton of different variables and outcomes that we know are directly influenced by government spending. I've listed a few there. There are many others. So I'll just briefly touch on some of these. Early childhood education opportunities, college attendance rates, home ownership, housing affordability, commute times, exposure to poor air quality, proximity to open space and parks, exposure to violent crime. All of these things are influenced sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways by government spending. And if we're spending that money differently or inequitably based on neighborhood, and there's a relationship between, well, you get the point. Next slide. Why do we see these patterns? There are a variety of reasons, and it of course represents generations of practices in the U.S. Probably first foremost is legacy spending. Historically, higher spending has been in wider areas due to redlining and jury racist policies that Professor Carlson discussed before and I touched on previously. That past spending affects current and future spending. For instance, let's say we built 7 nice schools in wider areas 40 years ago and 3 subpar schools in areas with higher concentrations of people of color. And so, 7 schools in wider neighborhoods, 3 schools in less white neighborhoods. That creates a state of good repair or maintenance burden. Those schools have to be maintained. They have to be kept up. So those 7 schools are going to require more money to keep them up than the 3 schools. And in many cities, New York, for instance, you see over 50% of the capital budget is associated with the state of good repair, maintaining those facilities and infrastructure that were created through policies that were not necessarily equitable. Why else do we see inequitable spending? Chasing of property taxes, which is related to pairing public investment with private investment. Municipalities tend to prioritize spending that results in greater tax revenue based on property values. And it's often easier to increase the value of already higher valued properties. For instance, let's say you build let's consider a new park. If we put that new park in an area of high home values, and it increases the value of those expensive homes adjacent to the park, that means additional property tax revenue to the city. If we put that same identical park in a neighborhood of houses that are far less expensive, while there would be an increase in the value of those homes, that increase is going to be smaller by virtue of them being valued less than the same park put in the more expensive neighborhood. And cities want their property taxes. And drilling down on that a little bit more, Professor Schuster brought up a local example in your area. Developers submit plans, and Professor Schuster, tell me if you think I've got this wrong, but developers submit plans, and the government review process looks primarily at safety, cost, and sustainability associated with those development plans. How does equity come into play in that development review? Sacramento, like most cities of any size, had redlining. You can find the maps online. They're readily available. Redlining represents decades of disinvestment and lack of wealth building in those communities. When a developer submits a project for review, if it requires city funds to support it, and that's typically the case, streets, sidewalks, water, sewer, impacts on the parks and schools, then the city could apply an equity lens in making a determination of whether to spend city tax dollars on the project. And again, that's what I mean by pairing public investment with private investment and how it can result in inequitable spending. Or the city could decide to say to the developer, no, this area has seen plenty of investment. If you want to do what you're doing, you'll need to find the funds on your own, and we will be steering our public dollars to neighborhoods that have historically received very little investment instead. New York has done some of this. We have a $1 billion neighborhood development fund that's used for capital improvements. We've rezoned a number of neighborhoods, typically, at least in this example, lower income neighborhoods, where we've rezoned to rezoned for more affordable housing, and we've tied those rezonings to this $1 billion neighborhood development fund. So we improve the infrastructure. The private sector is adding affordable housing, while at the same time, with this $1 billion neighborhood development fund, the city is investing in these communities as well. Is it enough money? Does it correct the problem? No, but it's just an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, why else do we see inequitable spending? Certainly the lobbying power of moneyed interest. Wealthier persons, business interests, they're the squeaky wheels. They beg, plead, and get, to a certain extent, resources. There's, in a lot of communities, local elected officials that may be interested in this issue may have few levers to actually affect municipal budgeting. The budget may be far more in the hands of the city agencies, the city manager, the mayor, than those local council members that may be closer to this issue. Institutional inertia. This inequitable spending has been happening for generations. Changing it is like, turning a cruise ship around on a dime. It's just not done easily or quickly, but that doesn't change the importance of it or the unfairness of it. I'm going to skip this last bullet. Okay, so I've described the issue. I've described the issue. How can it be addressed? I'm going to go back. I'm going to continue with Baltimore a bit. As I sort of mentioned, Baltimore has been incredibly transparent. They've done some studies on historic racial inequity in their spending, and has been very public about that work, and has created a number of tools for their citizens and advocates to use to help push the city in a better direction. They have designated a $55 million neighborhood impact investment fund. However, that's positive, but it's really a drop in the bucket in terms of the need. I mentioned Dr. Lawrence Brown at the very beginning of the presentation, professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore with the School of Community Health and Policy. He's described a moonshot that he feels like would truly go a legitimate and far way in properly addressing the inequity. And what he's called for with that is $290 million a year over 30 to 40 years. That would be 10% of the city's budget spent in formerly red line neighborhoods, with the spending determined by elected local community councils. He's also calling for a $3 billion racial equity social impact fund to go towards removing lead poisoning from the environment, housing needs, violence prevention, and other critical issues in underserved neighborhoods. Some of the media have called his moonshot reparations. Whether or not you think that's the appropriate term or not, it's just interesting to see the level of where this conversation is going in Baltimore. It's pretty exciting. The map that you see here on the lower right, this is, I think, a phenomenal tool. I haven't looked. I'm not sure. I think there are very few, if any, examples of this that are available in other cities. I could be wrong about that, but certainly not in New York. This allows anyone to go online and see planned capital spending and where it's occurring in the city. In the way I produce this map, which you can go online and play with it yourself. So the underlying data that's shown by the sort of grayish, dark green shading is the proportion of black residents in those neighborhoods. The darker the gray or green, the higher the proportion of Black residents. And then overlaid with that is the city's capital plan. You see the various dots and lines and polygons representing future schools, parks and recreation spending, and the like. So advocates can look at this and decide for themselves if they feel like the city's spending going forward is addressing the inequity issue. Okay, a couple questions popped up. That's great to see the Norwood example. Good. Oh, now it's run down again. Sometimes I feel like, what's the point to invest in these areas? Yeah, maintenance is, I don't know the particulars of that community, but maintenance within the facility, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned, can be a challenge. I'm not sure if these are owner occupied or owned by the developer or a management company, but I see what you're saying. Let's see, Professor Schuster, that is yes, got it. Okay, you answered that question. And I appreciate Professor Carlson's response as well. Yep. There's a lot more than just spending money on housing that affects neighborhood. When you get a new house, but when you see that the government in turn cares about prioritizes that area with decent sidewalks, nice street trees, streets that don't have potholes, nice parks, gives homeowners a pride of place and encourages everyone to do what they can from a maintenance standpoint. Okay. All right, switching back from Baltimore to New York, I talked about a few slides ago the inequitable spending with the Parks Department. So the one thing that the Parks Department has done to address the issue that I described earlier is it's called their Community Parks Initiative. They're spending $130 million to reconstruct 35 parks in the lowest income, highest density neighborhoods. Is it enough? Does it correct generations of inequitable spending? No, it doesn't. But it is a start, and it's something that the Parks Department is a way of looking at this that wasn't done in the previous administration. And they're certainly being transparent about the issue. But that's just one tidbit. So what do we need to do to systemically address the issue of equity and fairness in capital spending? A number of ways. Through legislation and policy, certainly. Some examples in New York. The City Council passed legislation in 2017 that requires equity action plans to address disparate outcomes by race. Unfortunately, it only applies to a few city departments so far and represents a very small portion of the total capital budget. But if it applied to all city departments, then they would all be required by law to undertake equity action plans and address policies and spendings. We also have a number of progressive policies that the administration has advanced. Let's see. For instance, I'm part of this initiative that I touched on earlier that's led by our Department of City Planning that will evaluate individual budget items through a number of different equity lenses, including how well the project serves vulnerable populations, and that includes lower income persons, children, and seniors. The initiative would identify the location of each budget item. You saw that on the Baltimore map, where each item in the capital budget, you can see where it is on the map. We don't have that in New York, or at least we don't have anything publicly available like that. This initiative would identify the location of each item and allow decision makers to prioritize projects and spending to better serve historically underserved communities. However, those are nice progressive policies, but they're also subject to the whims of elected officials who change over time. So without laws affecting this, it will not change quickly, if at all. Okay, but greater budget transparency. I've touched on this a few times. If you can't measure it, you can't improvement. For instance, New York's last capital budget, just for the current fiscal year, in terms of what's available to the public, is a 604-page PDF with very limited details regarding where projects are located. So, showed you what Baltimore's doing. Lovely map where you see all the capital projects. New York, on the other hand, all capital projects are contained in a 604-page PDF with very limited details on where projects are located. Obviously, when you compare the transparency between those, Baltimore and New York, there's a big difference there. Advocacy is huge with this issue. Much of what Baltimore and other cities have been able to achieve is due to a lot of hard work by advocates and engaged citizens. But their success relies heavily on government transparency around spending, which many governments are reluctant to do. Finally, actually I'm going to look, let's see. Question from Professor Schuster. Many homeowners associations in California require a 20-year fully funded assessment plan based on a maintenance review schedule. Do city planners take this into account when they review a project? Yes, certainly in New York, there's a new development that I'm working on that includes a 35-acre park, and the developer has had to identify a 20-year, actually I'm not certain what the time frame is, but it's something in the 20-year realm, plan for maintenance of the park in exchange for getting city land to build affordable housing on. So certainly, I think maintenance dollars are critical, and the more the private sector can step up, and the more we can require the private sector to come up and step up, the more we can transfer those maintenance dollars or state of good repair dollars that I talked about earlier that take up over half of New York's budget. We can spend that money in other ways, in better ways. Are the assessments by the city or the owners?
You actually just answered that for me. I was typing that right before you were answering it. So we got that. Cool, thanks.
Cool. Okay, going back to the last bullet point on my slide, legal hurdles. There are legal challenges to being transparent around some of this stuff. Many governments are reluctant to pull back the rug on the issue, in part due to potential legal ramifications. If we've been shortchanging communities for decades and continue to do so, what is our legal risk around even being transparent around this fraught? For example, Princeton University recently acknowledged publicly systemic de facto racism in many parts of the institution and an action plan for addressing it. This is existing de facto racism in some of their systems and a plan for correcting that. In response, they recently received a letter from the Federal Department of Education announcing that it is investigating the university for possible violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in any program receiving federal funds. And like many institutions, Princeton does receive some federal funds. What you have is Princeton attempting to correct de facto racist practices, not de jure. And as a result, they're now under federal investigation for possible de jure racist practices. And many see the move by the feds as nothing more than an attempt to squelch and silence other institutions from openly acknowledging and correcting de facto racism. that sort of thing will certainly have a chilling effect on municipalities being transparent on this issue. There's a lot of irony in there, I suppose. So, in terms of truly achieving equity and fairness, we have scratched the surface and have a long way to go. And with that, I am done. More questions?
So Douglas, I had one of the points you brought up was drilling down to local neighborhood planning. And so in our example that we're working on actually this week, it's a neighborhood called Arden Arcade, and they do have a they have a like a local planning council that then passes on their advisory to the county, because this is in a county area. And so how can these plan and we saw I pulled up a couple of examples for the class to look at from Santa Barbara and the like, where these small local planning groups are sort of run by somebody who's only thinking about money and his park and this and that. So how does this filter down from the large city or county down to the local planning group that's vetting it, down to, either the neighborhood planning group or the community planning group that's part of the larger planning group? How do these issues get down to them where there's a mechanism that can be used?
Well, I think we need to pursue things like what Professor Brown in Baltimore is saying. This $290 million a year that he's called for over 30 to 40 years, he would have the spending of that determined. He would have local community councils created that would be elected, democratically elected at a very hyper local level, and those community councils would direct that spending. Here in New York, we have what we call community boards or community districts. The city has they're sort of our lowest rung or most local level of government. The city has 60 of them, and they each produce a district needs statement that where they identify their capital needs, among others. But there's not necessarily there isn't a direct relationship between their identification of need and those needs being addressed. So I think there's we have, however, we just had a rezoning in the Brownsville neighborhood, and there was a community driven process. I mentioned our $1 billion neighborhood development fund that we use in areas that we're rezoning. So in Brownsville, the community came up with plans for how to spend a portion of that $1 billion that would be associated with their rezoning, and that plan is absolutely driving the spending. But without laws that mandate this sort of thing, it's just haphazard and depends on the your local elected officials and what they're willing or not willing to do, but forcing them, creating the political will certainly can come from advocates if advocates have the tools like what Baltimore is doing. Other questions? Let's see. Laura, I live in a community that has a situation like you're discussing. We have a local committee with the chair and our city council members. We've had a few issues, and these issues get escalated to the city council. That sounds like a positive framework there. Great. Functional. We like that.
Yeah. just one more thing, because this is one of the other ones that we've touched on. Can you speak a little bit to um, focusing a development on a particular group? So, as an example, um, in Santa Barbara, there's a guy who wants to make a retirement community, um, and he wants to market it as a Muslim community. So how does identifying a community help or hinder some of these things? Because I mean, I don't think you can do that. You can't put funds in to make a community just some way. As a matter of fact, usually we talk about not doing that. But there's a surface. Obviously, often on the surface, something looks really great. We've got a retirement community in Davis that's being proposed for Davisites, which is really good until you realize that there's two black people that live in Davis. So limiting it to Davisites is a little bit hard from that point of view. So can you kind of touch on a little bit of how the equity lens works when you're trying to specify how a neighborhood should be in some of these things? Because I don't think we're supposed to specify how a neighborhood should be. We're supposed to address, but based on these lenses. So that's always one of those tough arguments that are tough points of interest that can come up. So how is that dealt with in your area?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of legal hurdles to identifying specific populations for housing. For instance, in New York, for the most part, we subsidize the creation of. Well, first of all, New York has a huge public housing authority. I believe a quarter of all the country's public housing units are in New York. But we don't really build all public housing facilities anymore. What we do instead, there's Section 8, but I won't get into that. Here in New York, we subsidize, we pay developers to build affordable housing, and we're legally able to offer that housing based on income. For instance, a building can, for instance, we could have a building where we say 20% of the units are going to be sold at free market rates, so those wouldn't be considered affordable. 50% are going to be available for persons making X low income, and 30% are going to be available for formerly homeless persons. We're able to do that from an income standpoint. We're certainly not able to do it from the many things that are called out in the Fair Housing Act, rightfully so. We've had some discussions around creating affordable housing for artists. We haven't done that yet, and it's not anything I'm working on, but I understand that the legal hurdles to identifying, to earmarking public funds for specific groups not tied to income is difficult at best. So, yeah, with the Santa Barbara example, I think it would just be a matter of word of mouth. You're sort of, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe build a mosque next door, perhaps.
Yeah. That one is definitely under review by a lot of people. So, as you can imagine, to see what happens there.
Yeah. But certainly, from a zoning framework, you can influence. We have areas of the city where relatively small apartments, high density small apartments, are allowed, and we see a lot of our Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods have this zoning where you've got four bedroom apartments in mid-rise buildings. You don't see that in other parts of the city necessarily. and that tends to attract their relatively large families.
Cool. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. Douglas, I really want to thank you for doing this for us. This was super, super. I mean, it gave me a ton of stuff, and thank you for sharing those slides with us, and allowing us to record it. As usual, when one of these happens, it sort of drives my thoughts for the class in a different direction. But well, information is always more useful than not. I want to recognize that you've taken a lot of time out of your own personal time and your job to bring this to us, and I want to thank you for doing that. Normally, at American River College, we have this really cool place called the Design Hub that makes swag for everybody. When we're able to go back on campus, we promise you a whole bunch of cool swag to ship back to you to thank you for doing this for us. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, Randy's the best at swag, by the way.
I will. If there's an American River College coffee mug in my future, I won't say no.
And there we go.
Well, it's really been a pleasure. I love my work. I've been really fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, and it's exciting to be a part of a government that's thinking about and talking about these things. As I mentioned, I think more than once, we have barely scratched the surface. But I don't think 5 years ago we would have been able to talk about. I don't think any communities had lifted or cities had lifted the rug on this data and made us. With that, we're at least able to have the conversation. But conversations aren't enough. We need to shift our policies and our spending. But it is a start, and the more people become aware of these issues, the more we'll see change for the better and more fairness. So anyway, it was my pleasure. I appreciate it anytime. If there's any follow-up questions, you know where to find me. Thank you, Professor Schuster and Professor Carlson.
Cool.
Thank you so much. I just want to say, you closed some circles for me too, like on the talking about the history and made some more connections between many actually of the institutional racism things, some that maybe were obvious, but I just hadn't even like the connection between loss of economic opportunity and mass incarceration, which seems really obvious, and I talk about them individually, but how you talked about that in relation to communities I thought was also super important, and just drew some more connections for me as well. So thank you so much for showing the practical, here's what it looks like in 2020, and I think that's incredibly helpful.
Great, and thank you to the class. I really appreciate the thought-provoking questions, and if you have any follow-up ones, love to see them. So, great.
Cool.
All right.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.